Welcome to our December Liberalism in Practice panel discussion. This week we are talking about transgender sports policy. Is it fair? Is it inclusive? Is it safe? So a few show notes first. For those of you who are following us on YouTube or on X, feel free to type in your questions into either platform. We invite questions, we invite discussion and conversation with our audience. So anything that comes up, I will be moderating that towards the end. I know it's early for our American friends, so good morning, America. For our friends in Europe, good afternoon. And I want to do something a little bit different. Instead of introducing our guests, I'm going to have them introduce themselves first. So I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, but I want you to kind of expand on my introduction. So I'm going to start with Xander Keg. Xander is a director and a co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values, a good friend of mine. He is an award-winning social worker. He is the host of the Umbrella Hour podcast. So if you're not familiar with that, check it out. Xander, we are talking about transgender sports today, but I really want to get some background from you on where you come into the conversation in the first place. Who are you, and where is this conversation? Where is this topic important to the work that you do?
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Jennifer. Well, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm also a trans man. I started my medical transition just about 20 years ago, so I'm living the life, so to speak. I'm a member of the community. Now, when I say community, I mean that in a very sort of rough way. There's really no such thing as a trans community, in my opinion. We have a lot of different sub-communities. I'm part of what would be called like the FTM community, which is sort of an old way of describing people like myself who are female sexed, who took medical steps to live life socially as a man. And in some cases legally, some might call that a legal fiction, but it's necessary for documentation to match, our presentation to avoid all kinds of, interactions with the police and things like that. This is an interesting topic for me to be discussing. I was an athlete as a younger person, many, many years before transition. And so I can talk a little bit about, how it might have been for me had I had this experience of having males who are identifying as women or girls competing with me in sports in high school and out in the community. But, I'm not an expert by any means in physiology or in exercise I hit the gym almost every day, but that's about the limit of it. But I do have my ear to the ground within the trans community, so to speak, about the different arguments. And I got to tell you, we're not a monolith. And so there's no consensus in the trans community on this topic. So I might be able to present some of that.
Yeah, that's wonderful to remind ourselves that we aren't a monolith. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have these conversations. So Nafees, you are a social worker, also award-winning social worker, professor of social work, but your focus is on sports. And you've written on this issue before, transgender sports. So give us a little background again of you and how you came into this topic.
So my name is Nafees. Just as Xander mentioned, it's really an honor to be here. So thank you for having me. My background is as an athlete first, and I was asked to consider this topic for a presentation, which I presented at the Alliance of Social Workers in Sports Conference a few years ago, which then turned into a peer-reviewed publication, which now gets 180 downloads a month, which for a peer-reviewed piece I'm very proud of that. And so as a result of the success of that article, I've been asked to present more on this topic and write more on this topic as well. And my perspective is one of being as laissez-faire as possible and considering the concept of fairness, inclusiveness, and safety, and where lines are drawn. I am someone who marries questions and dates answers. And with that in mind, this conversation can certainly change my mind as far as like where I stand, but as far as where I am right now, I try to be as neutral as possible and try and consider all different viewpoints on the topic.
Thank you, Nafees. And your article, which we'll link to on fair inclusivity and safety, is actually where I got my questions. I thought that was such a great article on point and counterpoint on looking at these issues.
Thank you.
So now we've got Stella O'Malley. Stella, it's such a pleasure to have you on with GenSpec. This is our first time speaking with GenSpec. So in addition to giving an introduction on who you are and maybe how you come to this issue on transgender sports, could you give us an introduction also on GenSpec in general?
Yeah, sure. My name is Stella O'Malley. I'm a psychotherapist, and I had quite an intense and elongated experience of gender dysphoria. It would be called gender dysphoria now. It wouldn't have been called it when I was born. I was born in 1974 as a child. And ultimately, I grew out of it and moved on. Many years later, became a psychotherapist. Wasn't very interested at all in this world, but slowly became interested when it, became very much in the public consciousness. And I ended up doing a film about it in 2018, very much from the mental health viewpoint. Could any of the 4,000% rise in girls seeking medical transition be like me and grow out of it? Like, would it be premature to medicalize these, especially the girls at the time is who I was focused on? As a result, I kind of got propelled into this maelstrom that is incredibly political and heightened and difficult, let's face it, and didn't really want it and tried quite hard for quite a few years, maybe 3 years, to stay out of it and remain as a general psychotherapist. I released a book on anxiety in that time and stuff. But ultimately, I became very absorbed through sheer weight of contact. I got so many emails from so many people requesting so much help that it would have been immoral to turn away, really. And I formed GenSpec in 2021. As a voice for parents initially, but now our mission is to advocate for a healthy approach to sex and gender. So that's a very wide mission. And we're just trying to bring healthy, as in the wider context, mental health, physical health, holistic health, really, to the concepts of sex and gender. And even saying that gender is a fraught word, sex is a fraught word, everything in this is laden with difficulties. But I think it's very important that we learn to grapple with these issues, because there's been I suppose from my study of this, and I'm now doing a PhD, so I've completely yielded to my obsession. I'm doing a PhD in this subject, in gender dysphoria in children and young people. I think what has almost emerged, and in many ways, trans phenomenon has been the canary in the coal mine, because it has unearthed this extreme closing down of debate, a difficulty with handling conflict in the political realm and in the cultural realm. I think it's very influenced by, social media algorithms and likes and shares that seem to be bringing out conflict in people. I know Xander's very astute, because as far as I know, he stays off social media. And every time he says it, I think, God, wow, that's a whole choice. Because it's funny, when I joined the gender world, I kind of joined Twitter. I'd had this Twitter account from 2015. I'd say I did 2 tweets between 2015 and 2018, and then I started in 2019, January 2019. Or December 2018. I started tweeting, and now I'm as Twittery as anybody else. So sorry, I completely digress. But yeah, so we offer quite a few different things with GenSpec. Ultimately, we offer services for anybody who has been caught up in this kind of ideological maelstrom. We have a kind of a therapeutic branch which offers therapeutic support groups. That also offers funding for therapy for people who have been hurt by medical transitions, such as detransitioners. And we offer policies to lobby makers around the world. We're international, so we're very interested in the international context. However, the US does seem to be the center of the entire phenomenon, and so we're very focused on what's happening in the US, and we're particularly focused on the discussion, the cultural context, the hearts and minds of the people, and schools and education, and how much is being shaped by the schools and the educational settings.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, Stella, I think that you are involved now with the discussion that we're having in the Supreme Court, right, on the definition of gender and sex, and maybe that's something that we can get into, or are you not?
We are, yeah. We made a submission. We're making submissions all the time, so it's hard to keep up. But yes, we are, and certainly what's happening legally in the US, it's almost like going bankrupt. Slowly, then very, very fast. It's really fast. It's so accelerated what has suddenly happened in the US, having been at a snail's pace, or certainly for what seemed to me a snail's pace for the last few years. And, everybody was saying, Britain and Europe was going one way and America wasn't. And suddenly America has just reared up its head and is starting to move very fast with all sorts of lawsuits. And Genspec's very involved. We did, a file amicus brief for the recent, one of the many recent kind of cases.
And I think that we can probably get into that towards the end insofar as it would affect transgender sports policy, but we'll jump right into transgender sports policy right now. Nafees, I'm going to start with you on the question of, is it fair? Is it fair to have transgender, in particular, we're talking about transgender men competing with biological women. Is it fair? How would you answer that question?
This question of fairness and the topic overall is sort of a question where no matter what you say, someone is going to find offense to it. And so when I present on it and when I've written on it, I talk about this being a conversation between sexism and transphobia. So if a male-assigned athlete is permitted to compete against a female-assigned athlete, the public then views it as unfair to the female-assigned athlete, which would make it sexist. But if a male-assigned athlete is not permitted to compete against a female-assigned athlete, then the public might view it as unfair to the male-assigned athlete, which then makes it transphobic. So, there are a finite number of scholarships, there are a finite number of spots on team sports, there are an even smaller number of spots on individual sports. So in many ways, this is a zero-sum game. And, one party winning would essentially mean another party losing. But at the same time, this is a precedented topic. Allen Iverson was 6 feet tall, 165 pounds, who played against Shaquille O'Neal, 7'1", 324 pounds, both playing this game of basketball against one another. Different positions, but still on the same court with one another. At any NHL game, Wayne Gretzky has been head and shoulders above the second best athlete that's been in the rink. Tom Brady could simultaneously be the slowest, the weakest, and the best football player on any field at any time. And who can make the argument that playing against Cristiano Ronaldo or Leo Messi is ever fair? So I think the concept of fairness is something that may be artificial in this sense because sports has never been fair. On the other side, however, this might be a topic where we see it as, well, there's a clear advantage, whereas with Iverson and Wayne Gretzky and Tom Brady and all these other folks, there wasn't a clear pre-existing advantage. And there, I can counterpoint myself here in saying that it might be unfair because when it comes to powerlifting and weightlifting records, there's between a 60 to 70% advantage that male-assigned athletes have over female-assigned athletes, and about a 15% advantage when it comes to speed sports like swimming or running. Now, 15% in speed, and that's a significant amount because weight, it's much easier to double how much you lift than it is to, cut in half how fast you run. So I see both sides of it, and I see how some folks might consider it fair, might consider it unfair for that participation. But ultimately, whatever the decision is, and not saying that we're going to make a decision here necessarily, but whatever our decisions might be, it's either on the spectrum of sexism and transphobia, it's going to fall somewhere on that spectrum.
There is a lot to chew on that one. I'm sure we'll have some questions on that. Xander, what do you think? Is it fair?
It is an interesting question. I really like what Nafees had to say about that because advantages do exist with professional and elite athletes, right? We're talking about professional sports, elite sports. Typically, we're not talking about recreational sports usually, right? I mean, that does come up, but not as often. It's the types of athletic interactions that are leading to scholarships and rewards and setting times right? So we are talking about a very specific element of sports. You know, I went to a conference recently in Pennsylvania, and one of the keynote speakers, or maybe the keynote speaker, was Leah Thomas. And Leah Thomas was the swimmer, right? The trans swimmer, right? That was all over the news maybe a couple of years ago. And that, you know, I think kicked off a lot of this discussion, even though there were, and I'll just say trans women, just to shortcut it. I wouldn't call them trans men, because I would be a trans man, they would be a trans woman. So that's kind of the way we differentiate in the trans community. So I'll just call Leah Thomas a trans woman. But there were trans women who competed professionally in sports going back all the way to the 80s, maybe even the 70s, right? With Renee Richards, who was the tennis player. And so it's not as if it's a new phenomenon. But when I went to this conference, I sat in the room, I listened to Leah Thomas, who, by the way, gave a full, like 45 to 1 hour keynote address with no notes. It was impressive. She was engaging. Her story was compelling. I found her quite likable. I was a lot about her history that I didn't know, because it's not the kinds of things that would be covered in the news. And I understood, by the end of her time talking, I understood what motivated her to, and I know that it'll upset people that I'm saying her, but it's just simpler this way. What motivated her to pursue what she pursued as a swimmer on the women's team for the University in Pennsylvania, which at the time was not a violation of the regulations for the NCAA. However, as compelling as the story was, as much as I understood her reasoning, I still don't think that the NCAA was correct in their formulation of who is and who isn't permitted or authorized to be on a women's sports team based on something like how much testosterone is in the circulatory system, or if that's the correct way to say it. Because my understanding is that the level that they permitted at the time was still a very high level that not very many female, as Nafees has said, female assigned, I don't talk that way, but I understand the premise, female athletes don't reach, right? It's still very high. And are there advantages as a result of that? Not just at the time, but, you know, we have to think back to, and again, I'm not a doctor, and so I don't know how to talk about this in great detail, but I have read up and I have watched some interesting documentaries that talk about how a male in utero gets a little testosterone bath, and then within the first year or two of life has like a mini puberty that they kind of go through, where they get another wash of testosterone. So it's not as if the puberty in adolescence is the only time that this masculinization of the body or the brain or whatever, you know, is happening is occurring. And so it's interesting to talk about, you know, with fairness. It's, you know, Michael Phelps is just, by a gift of God, has been given this perfect body for swimming that took him to gold in the Olympics. Nobody would say it would be fair if all of a sudden he switched over to the females Olympic swimming team, right? So so there's this issue about, is it fair, isn't it fair, and advantages and disadvantages. And there just are certain physiological, my understanding is at least there are certain physiological, anatomical, and perhaps other types of advantages. But this idea of fair and unfair, as Nafees has pointed out, is a little bit more difficult. I've lost video.
Yeah, you lost video, but I can still hear you, Xander. So if you come back on, but we will continue to keep you in the conversation. So Stella, then there we go. Stella, to you, is it fair?
I don't think it's fair for male-born athletes to compete in female sports. I do think I want to point out about fairness in sport. I actually think fairness is an integral aspect of sports. No more than Xander, I was also an athlete as a child, and I really learned the spirit of fairness through my interest in athleticism. This is in swimming, running, all the different sports. And I remember, that there was my brother was a boxer, for example, and there's all sorts of kind of morality around sport that if you, for example, tip the ball and you shouldn't have, for example, in golf or snooker or something, if you're a good sportsman, and sportsman means fair, if you're a good sportsman, you will nod to the other side saying, I've made a mistake. You won't just rely on the referee. That would be what would be considered a good sportsman. So I would argue that sports rests fundamentally on fairness of categories. And the categories, for example, could be under 10s, under 12s. It could be for boxing, welterweight, middleweight, heavyweight, featherweight. There's so many of them, light middleweight. And the reason being is what sport is trying to do in this, and it's a beautiful concept, and has been for thousands of years, we've been doing it, is this idea of within certain parameters, some people seem to be almost touched by the divine, the same with art and music and poetry, that they can go to the peak of their body in a way that others can't. And that's what kind of amazes people, somebody who's amazing at basketball or football. And it's just like the beauty that they can demonstrate within parameters, because a 20-year-old man being brilliant around 12-year-old boys is not beautiful and not really very impressive. In fact, it doesn't feel great. It's missing the entire point of sports, because sports is about, I would have thought, fairness of categories, so that then we all now we're all categoried on a very similar way, as much as one could be, height, weight, age, sex, whatever it is. And then off we go, see who gets there first, see who is able to do it. When women started joining sport, there was a huge, huge backlash. We all know that picture. I think it was the Boston Marathon where that woman was running it. It's a devastating picture. And she was being hounded off the track. She was running the marathon. This is the 1960s, wasn't it? By men, because they didn't think it was seemly for a woman to run the marathon. We fought very hard for our rights as women. And testosterone makes men faster, stronger, taller, and better lung capacity, better endurance, better stamina, stronger hearts, stronger musculature, stronger upper body strength. There are so many advantages that are brought about by testosterone. And Xander is right. There is testosterone. It comes in a few different times. It comes in the womb for boys. It comes in again around about 2 or 3. It comes in again around about 8. And then full puberty happens at around about 12, roughly. And so, those hits happen all the way up, and it makes a phenomenal difference to the body. And so I think that is why it's not fair for male-born athletes to compete in female sports.
Before we get to our next question on inclusivity, I give an opportunity for panelists to expound on what they were thinking, ask each other questions.
Go on then.
Okay. All right. Well, then we will.
No, I wanted to make a comment. I like, Stella, what you brought up about, the different categories. And I noticed that James had also made a comment about that, that in different sports, they break it down by age. There's all these different categories, like you mentioned in boxing. And one of the things that I read about, within the last year, I think, and I'm not sure if it's in the United States or Canada, but there was some story about like a 50-something-year-old trans woman who was playing on a adolescent girls basketball team, right? And you were talking about how, yes, it's wonderful to have these, these gifts, these athletic gifts, but it doesn't look so beautiful when it's a 20-year-old man with a 12-year-old 12-year-old boys. And I'd say the same for, a 50-something-year-old trans woman with, 13, 14, and 15-year-old girls. Like, clearly they're towering over everybody else. In girls basketball, as in many girls sports, things are different. The net is lower, the ball is smaller. Well, you've got this person who could probably just walk up and like just put the ball right in the basket, and can hold it with a couple fingers probably. And so, it illustrates the disadvantage to the majority of the people that are playing on that team or who's competing against that individual.
So I wanted to bring up, though, I'll take, moderator here, and I want to bring up Nafees's point about sexism, though. Nafees, can you maybe flesh that out a little bit more and put it in context of this conversation here on fairness?
Sure. So if it is unfair for a male-assigned athlete to compete against female-assigned athletes, then that would, on that spectrum, be closer to what culturally would be considered more transphobic. And the question then would come up is like, we might be considering what is fair to female-assigned athletes playing with, on women's teams. How then would we achieve fairness for male-assigned athletes who no longer identify as men? How can we achieve fairness for those athletes?
I'm not sure we can. I think it's sometimes something happens, and the ability to be fair has been reduced. So if a person who's born female takes testosterone, transitions to become a trans man, that testosterone means that they are excluded from the female category because they have taken what would be considered performance-enhancing drugs in other contexts. Now, I think it's very important that we acknowledge the fact that it would be a huge enhancement. So I suppose in a way, when you choose to have a cup of tea, you can't have a cup of coffee. Like, is it as in you can't have it all in life? Sometimes you make your choices. You move to San Francisco, that means you're not moving to New York. That's the choices you make in life. It's a fundamental aspect of life. And trying to include everybody, it's, like Abraham Lincoln said, it's you're not going to please everybody all the time, and try to split something so that everybody is attended to when they have made decisions that has changed their bodies to a way that will enhance their ability to win. I don't think we can.
Well, one of the things that we have already done, in a completely different topic, is that there were gay and lesbian athletes who felt like they weren't included in intramural sports or recreational sports or in the leagues. And I have participated in many of these. We formed our own leagues, and there are still lots and lots of LGBT leagues for all kinds of sports. I live in Orlando, Florida. We have an organization that has it's a league that has maybe a dozen sports, right, for our community. And so in addition to that, there's, the local leagues, there's national, there's regional, and then those people compete in those levels, and then they can make their way up to the gay games, which was a way to say, if we can't compete in the Olympics, we're going to create our own Olympics. Originally, it was actually called the Gay Olympics, but I think somebody threatened a lawsuit and it became Gay Games. And so Gay Games has been around for, 3 or more decades.
Awesome.
And so, people compete in all the different, in running and weightlifting and every sport, boxing, that people are competing in. And so, and they set records and they do personal bests. Mm-hmm. And so there could be, in a lot of places, we could include in our leagues ways to incorporate trans people in that is fair. And then those individuals could come into our leagues. They're probably already in them and they could compete. And so, it'd be like a parallel option. Mm-hmm. And there could be scholarships awarded. There could be, money, there could be purses available, right? There could be their records could be listed in the books that keep those records, and they could go off to the gay games or maybe even the Olympics. And so it's not as if people are saying you can't play your sport, you can't do your thing. There have to be some limitations, right, or some boundaries or some borders that have already been set up just need to be reestablished. Title IX in the United States was very important when it was established, and it's still important today.
So I think that actually very nicely puts us into the inclusivity question. So let's go straight there. I don't know, Xander, if you want to start with the inclusivity question, but I think that you kind of brought us into that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways of looking at inclusivity. My father brought me up on the adage, if people don't open their doors to you, don't stick around kicking and banging on the door. Keep walking and knocking until somebody opens the door. So I wasn't raised, as a first generation Mexican American, I wasn't raised in a family or in a household or within a familial culture that was about resistance and protest. That's not, that's not my family. And I really appreciate that, because I ended up succeeding significantly by going through these parallel options that were always available to me. They might have been a bit more underground back in the day. I mean, I'm almost 60 now, so, things are very different now, but I was able to participate in all kinds of activities. And so what is inclusion? Is inclusion that all things and all people everywhere include all people everywhere and everything? Right? Is that what inclusion means? Or does inclusion mean that there are options and opportunities for what we want to do in other places? So, analogous to this would be if I was a theater geek and I wanted to be in theater and I didn't find that my local theater, was welcoming to, a trans man. Well, guess what I have at my disposal? I have LGBT theater companies. And there are talent agents, and I can get on commercials and on television shows and in movies as a trans person, playing a trans person or not playing a trans person. I don't have to go down the expected or the majority and I actually prefer that, right? I'm a nonconformist. In my book, The Third Space, I talk about where I cultivate, all these different options that fit me. So inclusion is going to look different to everybody. I have no intention of forcing my way in. That to me isn't inclusion. Forcing my way into something doesn't mean I'm being included. It might mean that I'm just have not yet experienced the rejection that is probably forthcoming, because it's nobody wants to have people forced on them or ideas forced on them, like an ideology. And also, it doesn't feel good to be rejected, right? So I don't want to minimize the experience of a person who is an accomplished athlete, who is trans and goes through a medical transition and therefore finds themselves in a position where they want to continue doing what they've been doing their whole life that they love, which is Leah Thomas's experience. And then they find themselves at a bit of a crossroads. And so I say, just go a parallel route and be the best that you can be. And you will most likely again rise and capture the attention and maybe be able to leap into where you want to be, but just go maybe a different route. Take the road less traveled, so to speak.
Nicely said. Stella.
Yeah, inclusion is a strange, I think, kind of concept that has kind of lit up in the last decade or so. And this DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I read an interesting article that was talking about MEI, which was merit, excellence, and integrity. And I'm more interested in integrity than inclusion. I think inclusion is a false premise, because if I don't have a ticket for the train, I'm not included on the train. if I don't have a ticket for a theatre, I'm not included into the theatre, that everything in society is exclusive and inclusive, depending on the rules of the institution, the business. You know, I'm not included in elementary school because I'm too old for it. And if a 16-year-old insisted on being included in elementary school, it wouldn't be appropriate because that person would be too old for it. And so kind of it's a false premise to pretend that everybody's included. No, they're not. Only people under certain categories are included in anything. And I really think that all we have to do is make sure that the categories are fair and respectful, and that everybody has an opportunity to join a category. So I love the concept of the third space. I think Xander is bang on when he says about, you know, the trans games, trans Olympics. I was a bit surprised that there was gay games because I thought, what is stopping them? But they obviously didn't feel comfortable, I would imagine, rather than they could technically have played in the, or, you know, ran in the Olympics or competed. But they were making a place for themselves, just like Xander's dad very wisely recommended, I thought, that you keep knocking, you find your space in life. Isn't that what we do? We find our space in life. And if you can't find it, you build it. And, you know, that's the American way, if ever there was. I do think that we have to call out this idea that pretense that everybody's included when they're not. They're only included on the basis of, usually they've bought their way in with a ticket, for starters, and they meet the criteria for inclusion. And so the criteria for inclusion is actually what we're talking about here. And I think, you know, trans games would really free up this situation. It would create it. We've seen it with the Paralympics. It created such a lovely community. It created such a strong sense of kind of dignity and a place in their own community that I thought was really, really beautiful. So I think that is the way forward on every level. I think that's the way forward.
Nafees, and
So-
give us some counterpoints too, Nafees. You know, give us some counterpoints too. I would love to.
Oh, absolutely. That's what I'm here for. So back in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, the court case, made it such that separate but equal was considered constitutional, was considered appropriate and fine. And over the course of several years, several decades, separate but equal was shown to be very unjust. And the separate but equal moniker was overturned by Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So the concept, and if we sort of copy and paste racial segregation into LGBTQ segregation, and we see that there is some legal precedence for sort of that third space being potentially seen as that level of segregation. Now, you know, the inclusion of trans athletes in sports seems right until, you know, it results in the exclusion of female assigned athletes. And then, you know, it's that spectrum where, you know, the inclusion of one would essentially mean the exclusion of another. And what I've noticed in my conversations with folks who are academics and also people from the general public is that many people consider that it to be common sense that male assigned athletes have a distinct advantage, and that's been numerically proven, over female assigned athletes. But common sense is the least researched area of all of science. And so there are very few peer-reviewed articles with, you know, full-on academic rigor on the topic of common sense. And so while many people might have anecdotal evidence of that, you know, this is unfair, I think in order to make a decision, we may need to be as inclusive, almost hyper-inclusive, maybe to a fault, to then gather enough data to be able to say, yes, this is what the advantage is. It goes beyond just Allen Iverson and Shaquille O'Neal being on the same court together. This is truly unfair inclusion. And so we should separate sports in this sort of way, have a men's league, women's league, and a trans league. But I don't know that we have enough empirical data yet. However, I'd have to yield to the fact that almost anyone that you speak to would apply common sense and say this is unfair. But common sense is just not well researched enough, would be my position.
Feedback to that before we ask about safety?
Oh, I think there's more than enough empirical evidence. It's quite clear that testosterone brings about a significant advantage to anybody that takes it, and to disregard the evidence isn't. We've got through everything that Nafees, I think, has articulated, has been done over the last 100 years. We started with sports; it was mostly male, and slowly but surely, female categories started to come in. And so did age categories and lots of different categories. And now we've become highly categorized in sport with weight, etc., and age. So there's, the kind of the older age as well as the younger age are being catered for. So that's exactly what we've done. We don't need to start again. What trans people need to do is figure out where they should be placed, if you follow me. Because arguably now that there is greater numbers of people with who have medically transitioned, they now have either a hormonal advantage or a disadvantage that skews the level playing field, and so now it has to be countenanced. I think that answers really, what Nafees said.
Another thing I would add is maybe an argument that might come from certain corners of the trans community might say, right, because Nafees, you said something about if trans women are included, then females are excluded. And it's like, I think the argument might be something like, well, it's not that they're not included. Obviously, they're still there. They're still competing. They're still winning. They're still, they still have their teams. It's just that maybe instead of first place, they got second place, and boom, 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 right? It might, and that might be something they don't like, right? But, all's fair, in sports. So I don't have that argument, but I could hear somebody making the argument. It's like, it's not that they're not included. You can obviously see them all there. Riley Gaines is standing next to Leah Thomas. She was not included. Yeah.
I think the inclusion and that topic sort of like evolves eventually into this concept of almost like making fun of it, in that like some people might say, well, if I have a son and he's not good at men's sports and I don't want to pay for a college education, like I'm going to tell him to, identify as a woman so this way he can get that, women's basketball scholarship, whatever it is. I don't know if there are actual examples of that happening, but at the same time, I can certainly see how the thought process would lead us in that direction. And certainly, I would imagine that over the coming decades, we'll see at least one example of that attempt being made, because colleges, they could be up to $100,000 a year, and athletic scholarships can cover all of that and then some. So, it's Charlie Munger who mentioned that, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And if there is an incentive, and I'm not yielding my point of view, I'm just sort of, showing that I do understand, if there's an incentive to be trans or, cosplay trans in order to get financial gain, I can certainly understand both of your points in that there's going to be someone that does it. And then if one person does it, what's going to stop others from doing it too? If there's so much financially to gain, $500,000 over the course of 4 or 5 years.
Could I come in on that point if I could? I do think I was waxing lyrical about sportsmanship and how noble sports people are. There's a whole category of sports people who are extreme cheaters that have really cheated to awful degrees, who have really, I've watched and read the books and the documentaries about these cheaters who've taken really extreme measures to take performance enhancing drugs. And cyclists, for example, is particularly, riddled with it, as swimming was for a time. And, some of these cyclists are dying very, very young. So it's an extraordinary urge to win that drives them. And I do think people will cheat. I think there's a certain section of society that consistently over the generations have cheated. And so I do think they will. Whether they've done it or not is irrelevant. Have we got a loophole so that they can? Well, we should, anticipate it, because that's what the law does, and closes up any loophole. And, for somebody in the comments said about the range of testosterone. Yeah, testosterone does range in levels. I remember I used to think that I had high testosterone for various reasons. And I was talking to an endocrinologist, and he started giggling, and because I was kind of being quite serious about my high levels, my presumed high levels of testosterone. He says, you could have the highest level known to woman, and you're still a drop in the ocean compared to men. So let's say for women, it's roughly about, depending on the age and the person, 10 to 50 nanograms of testosterone a woman would have, while, a man would have roughly, again, 300 to 1,000 nanograms of testosterone. It's a phenomenal difference. And it's testosterone. If I took testosterone for a year, I will be stronger, bigger, broader. You know what I mean? I'd be able to give a better punch. It's testosterone that I'm zeroing in on. I do think, that we were talking about, categories. I think there's a case to be made. I've always thought there's a case to be made. It's a very dangerous case, but it's kind of a libertarian streak in me to say, well, what about the non-category sport? A kind of free-for-all. Take your drugs, do what you need to do. Because frankly, cyclists seem to be so riddled with it that, and, some other categories of sports, that maybe there should be a kind of a free-for-all, as in take what you need to take to get what you need to do, if that is your thing, because some of them, they are doing it anyway, so they could go into the performance enhancing, which is almost transhumanism part of sports, while other people could go into no, I'm just going to train because I want to stretch my body to its limits and no more. That's what I'm interested in doing, because that's what's intrigued, mankind for thousands of years. How far can I go just on my will and my kind of body? How far can I push my body? It's an interesting question. Yeah, but a bit wild.
I love that. I love that, having a space for that. Someone who used to compete in figure competitions. I mean, that we would test our testosterone, right? Because of that. And I mean, yes. And, but at the elite level, women are using testosterone. So, I mean, I would only compete and so in bodybuilding, there's like natural, there's natural categories, and then there's I guess kind of the free for all. And I think that the natural, most people were more interested in that, either competing and or watching, participating, because it was that idea of stretching your natural abilities to the highest level. All right, I'm going to move on to our last question, because I know we've got a lot to digest here. To me, this is probably one of the most important questions. And I think, Nafees, when we talk about kind of sexism, this is where I think this question erases any aspect of sexism when we're talking about sports policy, women and men in different sports. And this is safety. So we've seen this a lot now. Now, what I will say is, with regards to transgender sports policy, and this is what makes it hard, and Stella, I think you touched on this, there are certain sports where it just might not matter that much, right? And then we were talking about weightlifting, boxing. I mean, it matters there. Pickleball, maybe it doesn't matter. Some of the other sports that we have, breakdancing in the Olympics. I know I'm being silly, but there are a lot of sports where it does matter and where it is truly a safety issue. So, Nafees, I'm going to start with you on this one. Is it safe?
Well, every season in many sports that I'm most familiar with, NFL, NBA, and the MLB, there are new safety protocols that are drafted and often completed after piloting. They're for example, with football, you were able to chop block below the knees, and now obviously you can't. You were able to clip block in the back. Now you're not allowed to, because of those safety reasons. There are horse collar tackles that have been banned. In basketball, you'd be able to put your foot forward, so this way, if the jump shooter, you could impede their landings, and they would often hurt themselves in their ankles. Baseball players now wear C-flaps on their helmets, and they're required to protect against 105 mile an hour pitches. Just to put this into context, a 9mm gun, the bullet breaks skin at 102 miles per hour. And there are some pitchers that can pitch at 105 miles an hour. So When we talk about safety, there are new safety protocols that are developed every single year, and I have an idea of what the new NFL safety protocols will be next year, given some of the injuries that have been happening this year. So, sport, is it supposed to be safe? I don't know that it is. I mean, some sports, you with football, you have to sign certain waivers that say that you essentially agree to potentially being paralyzed or even dying. As early as high school, my mom, my goodness, like it took forever for her to sign that piece of paper that said your son might be paralyzed or die playing this sport. Shed many tears. So we athletes, we and all four of us are athletes, right? We know what we're getting into, and we know that we are entering a somewhat dangerous environment, given whatever sport that we play, given certain sports might be more dangerous than others. But at the same time, I do understand the counterpoint where it's an unnecessary element of danger that wouldn't be there if competition was fair and inclusive in a certain kind of way. So that's certainly a given as well. But I think there's more nuance to it, is what I'm trying to say. Is that to say that trans athlete inclusion is automatically unsafe for athletes who are not trans? Well, that might be true, but it's also true that sports are always getting more dangerous as athletes become more and more, faster and stronger. The NFL, these are human weapons. You tell me that a 260-pound linebacker running a 4.4 40 is not a human weapon. You tell me a pitcher that can throw faster than a bullet is not a weapon. So it's getting more dangerous whether or not trans athletes are included.
Xander.
Well, I won't add too much more because I think Nafees covered a lot of ground. One thing I'll add is, as an athlete, you condition yourself, right, for your particular sport. And in some cases, you might, like say in boxing, right, you go through a process of like a practicing before the big event with people that you expect to be encountering, right? So if you're a female boxer, you're most likely going to be in lower level competitions or bouts with other female boxers. And so you've conditioned yourself to be in the ring with other females who may be bigger than you, faster than you, stronger than you, but still female boxers. And so when you all of a sudden step into a ring and now you're boxing with somebody who is either a male boxer who's identifying as trans, or in some cases, I guess we've heard the possibility of an intersex boxer with a very high level of testosterone, then all of a sudden that's going to be different because the force of that punch is going to be very different. And there are differences in the thickness of the skulls or the craniums of males and females on average. And so, when you condition yourself to take a punch from a cross spectrum of female boxers, that doesn't condition you for that male boxer that you're now stepping into the ring with. And so I think that, I don't think that I can't think of, maybe I'm just missing something, how there might be a safety issue with, swimming. But, with boxing, I can definitely think of that. With rugby, with absolutely, I could think of, some safety issues that come with certain sports. So I think, again, it's similar to categories based on a lot of different factors. And then maybe there's also safety as a factor, but it's going to look different in every sport.
Yeah, I thought what Xander said about the entire premise of being an athlete is to condition yourself for the competition. And so you're working towards, July the 4th is going to be the competition or whatever it is, if you follow me, and that's what it's going to be. And that's what you're priming your body for. Now, if you don't know that your opposite, your opponent has had, a huge amount more testosterone than you, will have strength that you have never encountered. I remember, a notable example of that was Fallon Fox in MMA about 10 years ago. And Fallon Fox was a trans woman fighting in MMA, fighting another biological woman, and within 39 seconds had fractured the skull of his female-born opponent. And that was to me, that raised a huge safety issue. You know what I mean? Because that female opponent would have thought she was going to be meeting somebody of her ilk. And actually, as she was interviewed later, said she never felt strength like it. Of course she didn't. She'd never fought a man in MMA. When you look at MMA and you look at boxing, originally there was bare knuckle fighting for boxing. And then the Queensberry rules came in, and more rules came in, and safety comes in, and there's helmets and there's everything. MMA seemed like a free-for-all in the 1990s. It was wild. And now it seems to be going the very same way. It's we're a few decades in and it's getting safer and safer. And what Nafees said was so, I don't know, chilling, because it's true. Some of these athletes have become weapons. They're so strong. They're so powerful. Where are we going with this? I don't know. I don't like all the safetyism and professionalization of sport, because I think it's taken a lot away from the beauty of sport. I don't know where I go with that, because the safety is necessary. There's no doubt about it. But the level of ability of some of these athletes, they are phenomenal. Their strength is phenomenal. And they're priming themselves to be dangerous in something like boxing, or that's what they're building their body to be as effective, powerful, and violent as such as possible, depending on the sports. Where will that go in 100 years? I can't see where we're going to have so many safety. They'll be crawling through kind of some sort of gel to get to their opponent. I just don't know where we're going. They'll be so strong, they'll be able to do it.
It makes me think of that movie. I think it was a short story that was made into a short movie. Something about really beautiful people had to wear masks, and really strong people had to wear heavy weights, and really smart people had to have noise constantly in their ears to disrupt their cognitive capacity, their intellectual capacity. And it was intended to even out. I wish I could think of the author in the story.
It's a famous book,
right?
Or something.
To
Short story.
Even out so that nobody was better, smarter, prettier, handsomer than anybody else. And it's a very terrible story. But as you were talking, Stella, it reminded me of, I hope I don't get these athletes wrong, but I'm remembering the battle of the sexes between, I think it was Billie Jean King and maybe Arthur Ashe. Was that the tennis player? And it wasn't as if it was a level playing field, and they recognized that. They had to make some adjustments to make it fair between the female tennis player, the best female tennis player. And I don't even think the male tennis player, if it was Arthur Ashe, I don't know if he was considered the best at the time, but he was very good, highly accomplished. And I've even heard Martina Navratilova say, it wouldn't be fair if it was just everything was kept straight across the board. There's also this interesting phenomenon that there's a whole slew of middle school boy runners who have already bested the fastest woman runner in the world, right? There are just certain realities that seem to be at play here that bump up against, within the trans community to a certain degree, realities that we just don't like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right? Because, I did all that I did, right? I took I take the hormones. I've had the surgeries. I've spent hundreds of dollars to go through the legal process to change all of my name and my sex marker and all my identity documents. And then if I were to have this experience of going out into the world and having everybody say to me constantly, "You're not a man, you're not a man." Now, for me, that wouldn't actually bother me, because they wouldn't say, they would say, "You're not male." And I'd say, "Yeah, duh, I'm not stupid. I know I'm not male." Right. But not everybody in the trans community takes that same line of logic or, to their identity. And so it's, I guess, I understand the reality of it, and I also can definitely empathize with the disappointment and the feeling of being left out or not, appreciated. I get all of that, and I just don't know how we're going to come to the table together to talk about these issues when, unfortunately, on both sides of the issue, they have rather strident, views and uncompromising, positions where the majority of us would probably be able to come to the table and sort this all out. But there are elements within our two, quote, factions, so to speak, that are going to make that nearly impossible. I personally think we should ignore those more radical elements of the two sides of this argument and come together and work this out.
Well, the third space, right, Xander?
Yeah, and it has to be reality-based. Let's not deny reality. There is such a thing as biological sex. It's defined in many different ways. And I know there's arguments. I mean, I know trans doctors, medically trained doctors, who will deny that there's such a thing as biological sex. And they're doing it in this very sophist way, right? It's wordplay. It's a game. It's just a game, and we should stop it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to take a couple of James's questions here, and anyone else in the audience, please feel free to type in your questions. James, we've addressed some of your questions as we were kind of going through. If there's one or two that we missed, if you could repaste them in now, and I will make sure that those get addressed. And for anyone else, I'll have you also.
I looked up what Xander was talking about because it's a very good point. The Battle of the Sexes, and it was Billie Jean King versus a guy called Bobby Riggs, and he was 55 and she was 29. Yeah, so they were still trying to categorize. They were still making sure it was an older man versus a younger woman, and they've done that a few times. I think John McEnroe, and they did it with the Serena. Serena Williams played, I don't know, somebody was ranked 200 or something, and I think he still won. So it has been played out a few times. I think it's a well-known fact. And that dystopian novel, I'm going to read it again. Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut is the guy who wrote it. Yeah, and it's Harrison Bergeman. So it's a lesson in equity, that novel. Well, it's a short story, I think, but it's a kind of like, well, that's where, if you want to equalize everybody, are we all going to be the same? Or can we just say, vive la différence, let's just appreciate difference.
I think that you just touched on it, though. It's a story of the difference between equity and equality. Yeah. Yeah. And Nafees, while we're waiting for any more questions, I think, for me, this is where I struggle, and maybe I'm just misunderstanding part of your argument, but with this argument on sexism, like for me, if I'm told I can't compete with a man, I don't feel like that's sexist. I feel like I'm still equal to a man, but I know I have different testosterone levels. I know I have different. And so for me, I don't see that. I don't define that as sexism. I just, equal in a different way.
Yeah. No, it would be sexist in that if biological females are thought to be the same as biological males, that would be the sexist argument, is that to assume that there is no difference between the two. But then to say that trans athletes should not be included despite that fact, that might make it then transphobic. I don't think, when it comes to this conversation, I don't think we could have a conversation about who should be included without also having a conversation about who should be excluded, because this is a zero-sum game, that it's a finite number. And so that's what makes it so difficult, right? I think, the four of us are a proxy for really the entire world right now that's trying to have this conversation and trying to figure out where do we go. And nobody wants to, be offensive or hurt each other's feelings or get canceled or anything like that. And so, as Xander mentioned, like the fact that we're walking on eggshells, it means that we're not able to operate in reality because we're worried about what reality might show, because reality will be exclusion for a party. Whether it's, trans athletes are included, and now, as we talked about, and Stella mentioned as well, where it's incentivized in this kind of way, and now there's cheating, where biological males who feel like they're not good enough to participate in men's sports now choose to participate in women's sports, thus thereby making women's sports sort of like a junior varsity league versus a varsity league. Or it could mean the exclusion of trans athletes, in which case, it's biological females only that are participating in these sports. And then, we have separate but equal leagues. And then that also opens up legal precedents with Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education. That's why we're walking on these eggshells, because most of us know exactly what reality is. It's common sense. But again, I still maintain, despite the number of empirical pieces, as Stella and Xander mentioned, I think there needs to be yet more. So this way, more people are encouraged to understand that there are truly differences between the biological sexes. Again, there's just too many people that fall on the side of, well, we don't know. I'm not saying that I'm one of them, but I am speaking up for those people, and that if they don't know, then we need to inform them. We need to gather the data to inform them. I'll also say that it differs as to whether or not someone has been an athlete. The four of us being athletes makes a difference. So this is somewhat of a specialized conversation. I've noticed that those who have not boxed, I'm a boxer right now, and it hurts no matter who hits me, And what if you've been an athlete, you're very aware of those differences, differences of height, differences of weight. And if I look at your body compared to mine, I know what I can do to you in the ring, and you also know what you can do to me. I'm 247 pounds, so I'm a bigger man. But if you're smaller, you're thinking, I'm definitely faster than him, which you'd be right. And I'm thinking, I'm definitely stronger than him, which you would probably be right in that sense. So being an athlete makes a difference in this discussion as well. But however, not having experience in athletics, you're sort of thinking that, well, everyone should be included. What does it matter? It's just a sport. I think more people need to understand that these differences do exist through empirical evidence.
I think the point, Nafees, that you were making about, especially about the boxers, is that the lighter, faster boxer probably could go longer and just wear down the bigger, stronger boxer. And then when they're tired and, weakening, then that quicker, smaller boxer is going to start pummeling them and topple them over, right? Like, not always, but it's a strategy, right? We haven't really talked about how there are strategies to sports. And
you just explained why I lose most of my fights.
Right. And for those of us, I started out very young in sports, and I went all the way through high school. I didn't continue into college, but I continued into, community and recreational sports. And, it was fairly rare to meet somebody who just walked onto the field, never having played anything before. Like, there's a certain level of muscle memory and physical acuity, and right, there's just something that comes, between somebody who is an athlete versus somebody who plays a sport. Like, it really is, there's a difference there.
Yeah.
So I've got a question that's coming from the audience, and this kind of addresses something that James also put in on what is the purpose of sport. So this question is, Stella, you mentioned joy. Most find joy in winning, and while some find joy in winning at any cost, including cheating in ways that sacrifice health, are we really embroiled in this controversy more out of concern for audience joy than athlete joy? Are we overemphasizing emotional care, ensuring that an infinitesimally, I can't say that word, sorry, that's too early, small percentage of trans athletes can feel the joy of a particular kind of competition? Sports aren't safe. Driving isn't safe. Some psychology evidence suggests that we seek risk at different levels because of the joy of surviving it. Are we having this conversation because we have a lower threshold?
A nice, easy question.
I know. I mean, of course. But this comes. I'll call her out. This comes from our psychologist, Elizabeth. So you know that nothing's easy. She wants to dig in.
What was the last? Are we seeking joy? What was that last bit? Are we seeking joy? Is the last question.
Are we? Sports aren't safe. Driving is safe. Some psychology evidence suggests that we seek risk at different levels because of the joy of surviving it. Are we having this conversation because we have a lower threshold?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I do kind of worry about, the level of safetyism that has kind of crept into everything in life, which dulls the feeling of risk, which dulls the entire concept of excitement. And very often that's why people gravitate towards certain sports, because they like the risk taking. That's what's kind of exciting about it. So there's this human nature instinct that gravitates towards risk. And then as we get more and more athletic, the risk becomes untenable. And so the risk is dulled. And so it's sports itself, it's getting itself into a bind. I think the trans issue is a separate issue. I think, performance-enhancing drugs arguably arrived before the trans issue in sport arrived.
Yes. And
so we actually have a lot of data around performance-enhancing drugs and sports. And we're aware of how key it has been for some fairly dubious wins in huge competitions. So I don't think that's anything to do with risk. I think that's to do with cheating. And I think sometimes, Leah Thomas is a good example. Leah Thomas wasn't a very successful swimmer when he was competing as a male. And then when he crossed over to being a trans woman, when he medically transitioned, became very successful. And so that would worry me, I would say, because I think if I took something that would make me just so much more superior than my fellow competitors, I think I'd bow out. I think I'd say I've had my day. I think it's not fair for me to compete. That would be my feeling. I think I would bow out. I would self-exclude. And I'm surprised Leah Thomas didn't. That's not stopping swimming. That's stopping competing.
Yeah. It's what you said earlier about sportsmanship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This issue of safetyism, I would imagine, and Nafees, you probably know more about this, I would imagine that the reason for all of this constant eye towards safety is a liability issue. It's the law getting involved in sports so that owners don't get sued, stadiums don't get sued, individuals who cause the harm don't get sued. I would imagine that's probably what is happening there. And it's going to get to a point where, maybe it'll get to a point where, the baseball players are going to go out in the field, wearing full armor, like they're out for a joust or something to protect themselves.
It's close to happening. We see some of the elbow guards some of these guys wear, basically like the medieval times.
I want to see the codfish. Let's get codfish back in here.
I do too.
It is a liability issue, of course, because if you can legally prove that one athlete has a dangerously higher advantage than another athlete, then the athlete that loses, even if it's not a contact sport, they would have the right to sue. Now, what happens in court, we don't know. But just the justified pursuit of a legal case would be something that leagues would want to avoid, because you might be innocent in the court of law but guilty in the court of public opinion, and no one wants to go to court, period. So part of it is a legal issue. But Elizabeth also, in the first part of her question, asked, whose perspective are we taking when it comes to joy? Is it the spectators or is it the athletes? Because from the athlete's perspective, it is very personal. If I am a trans athlete trying to compete in women's sports, for example, then the personal examples are both from myself, because I want to be included. I love my sport. My gender, sexuality has nothing to do with the sport that I love. So you might say, well, okay, so I feel for him, and then or her in that example, right? But then you might also take the personal stories of the athletes that I'm competing against, and their personal stories there as well. Now it becomes really contentious in that sense, because it's so personal. From the spectator's point of view, some spectators are like, well, I love the New England Patriots because they won Super Bowls every year. So they want to see unfair advantages. There's a whole faction of people that want to see a regular guy running with the Olympic athletes. So this way they can see how much better the Olympic athletes are than the regular guy in real time. And of course, there are other spectators who value sportsmanship, who value parity of athletes and of teams. They don't want to see teams blowing other teams out by like 10 percentage points or 20 percentage points, which feels very unfair. So that then leads to the idea. Oh, we lost Xander again. Hopefully audio is still there.
No, he's coming back.
But hopefully that creates an even larger gap in literature and gap in understanding of what we should do. And that I know I sound like a broken record here. That's why I feel like we need to have more empirical evidence before we make some sort of decision. I've talked, publicly about, merging men's and women's sports completely. I know. Please don't yell at me, Stella. I'm going to quickly explain myself, and I understand you certainly oppose that point of view, even if it's for a 5 to 7 year period, because I think there are plenty of women in the WNBA, and I can name them: Asia Wilson and Brittany Griner. So Asia Wilson went on record just recently saying that she could defeat Josh Hart, who is a men's basketball player. And then Brittany Griner went on record saying that she could defeat DeMarcus Cousins, who's, men's basketball. So these conversations are being had by WNBA players as well. Now, I'm only connected with basketball in this sense, and there is no WNFL. So I can't really comment on women's football, but in women's basketball, there are women's basketball players that do think that they can be better, they can win against NBA players. So my argument is that why don't we merge and figure out if that is indeed the case? And if it's not, then we can, unmerge and separate the leagues again. But I think we need to gather that data, because it's not just the general public or even the academic public that has these questions. It's the actual athletes that are playing in these leagues, like Asia Wilson, like Brittany Griner.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because it's an important point to discuss. I do think that there should be another category where there can be some sort of free-for-all. And often, by the way, the men's category is a mixed category. It's just always men. You know what I mean? In certain category, in certain sports and stuff, it is actually the mixed, but it's just always men. But I agree. I would love for there to be opportunities for people to test these out, to have, Xander's third space, but it doesn't have to close down this competition. It can run in parallel. I'd be all for it. I would caution a bit of safety to people, but there's something about the female athlete. I was just thinking of an Irish athlete in particular, the female athlete who they really want to beat the men. Do you know what I mean? It's a kind of an instinct from when we're very young. It's kind of, I can beat the boys. We're driven that. So it doesn't surprise me even one tiny bit that there's some brilliant female athletes saying, I can beat him and I can beat him. Let me at him. And in certain sports, in basketball, like somebody will come at us and tell us it's very violent or whatever, but I'd be kind of all for, let's have that in parallel. Let's have it. It could be very interesting, but I would be cautionary about the type of person who goes into certain sports is often very brave, very courageous, likes to test their limits, can be a little bit foolhardy, and can bull into competitions that they shouldn't be going into. You know what I mean? And I would worry a little bit about that, especially the female athlete who has raised up all the years. When she was a girl, she bet the boys. It's a point of pride. Mm-hmm. And so I see why she's circling back to wanting to beat the boys now. It doesn't surprise me, and I'm all for it, so long as there is still separated categories where people can test themselves to their limits in the fairness of the category.
But I think Xander touches on this. I think that's part of the problem. I think Nafees, you as well. We can't have these common sense dialogues, right? Everything is hijacked. Even if, I think, as a matter of fact, I do think most people have these common sense dialogues. We're just hijacked by social media, which why Sanders not on social media. That seems to be the national narrative, even when it's not. But this idea of a third space or a parallel route is, I mean, it's just common sense. The fact that that hasn't even been offered up as a solution to transgender policy is, to me, what's unrealistic and insane.
Me too.
Yeah.
One of the things we haven't really talked about is the role of the coach. And, you know, so I think something that a coach can give is restraint, right? The coach lets us know what our limits are and pushes us beyond our limits, hopefully at a pace that isn't going to be too taxing mentally, physically, and helps build us up and gives us encouragement. And what I want to also say about coaches is that, unfortunately, in some of these cases with trans women on women's teams, especially in college, maybe in high school, is the way in which the coaches have treated the female athletes who have expressed concerns about competing against a trans woman athlete or being on a team, right? In the case right now, there's the San Jose State women's volleyball team, and you know, there are members of that team that have concerns. There are other teams that have forfeited games against them. And so where are the coaches in all this, right? Because the coach is the person that we're spending a lot of time with. And I wish they were, I don't know, I guess maybe they're doing the best job they know how to do. They probably have a lot of pressure on them from directors of the athletics departments and presidents of universities and alumni. And I'm sure there's a lot of pressure. But when I hear stories about how coaches have told the players, you know, or the people on the team, listen, get with it or get out, right? You do as you're told, or if you don't want to be in that bathroom, then go find another one. Or we're going to make you all go through training to get more sensitivity and awareness. And I wonder what the coach's role has been in this, and if there's any conversation that's happening in that profession around what's being asked of them and what their role has been in all this.
It depends. Oh, go ahead, Stella.
You go ahead and then I'll come in.
So if it depends on, you know, how secure the coach is in their job. Like if I have a 500 record and, you know, I'm fighting to keep my job, and there's a trans athlete that comes up who has a clear athletic advantage, I'm not particularly thinking about fairness. I'm thinking about my job. I'm thinking about feeding my kids, you know, in that example. So that introduces a whole new concept because it's so nuanced. Now, if I'm a coach that is tenured, I'm a Hall of Fame coach, that I might have a different opinion on. And this also, it's coaches, it's also parents. Like I can tell you that, you know, it's important that I'm having this conversation, and I don't know if the audience knows this, listeners know this, but it's important to understand that I do not have daughters. I don't have sons. I don't have children. If I had a daughter, I can promise you that my perspective would be different. Right? So I'm speaking as a scientist who is a completely neutral party. If I were to have a daughter, or if I were to have like a cousin that I'm really close to who's a female, who's an athlete, then my opinion would be very different. So I think there's a flaw in my argument as well, which I will also yield, in that there's a flaw to being too neutral. It's like you don't have a horse in the race, Nafees. You're just an athlete, a former athlete, maybe somewhat of a current athlete, talking about it from an athletic perspective, not taking into account those personal stories that exist. So there are coaches, there are parents, and there's so much nuance there. And that's what makes it such a difficult equation to solve.
I have been waiting for the dads to come out. The dads, you know, saving their daughters' sports. It's such it's a huge gap that hasn't been filled yet. But as well as that, the coaches play such a strong role in sports. And, you know, some coaches, and we've seen all the, you know, the gorgeous films where the coach is in the corner and he's beautiful and it's beautiful. And then there's some very, very cutthroat coaches who are, you know, I think of some gym coaches and stuff, and oh my God, they do not have the best interests of their athlete at heart. They want the gold. And go to great lengths. And it's kind of a little bit surprising, but just to bring it up a little bit, those with intersex conditions, those with kind of, conditions that would give them hormonal advantages. For example, people with intersex conditions are, and I know this is an extraordinary number, but they're 140 times more likely to win in the female sports, in the elite female sports. So these are females with hormonal advantages that have intersex conditions that give them that hormonal advantage. That hasn't been really reckoned with, and I think it will over the next 10, 20 years. I think the Olympics, the World Championships, the fact is there have been for decades women with hormonal advantages winning in elite sports at a much higher rate than women without these intersex conditions. So that muddies the field in an already complicated field. Now, then you've got the kind of the cutthroat opportunists. And so now we have a situation where certain sports coaches are actively looking for children with sporty children with intersex conditions. Because if I was an intersex child, if I was a child with an intersex condition, and that was the one place where I was going to actually kind of succeed, because I might be odd because of my born condition, and I'm brilliant on the sports field, and then you've got nefarious coaches who are actively looking for the signs of certain intersex conditions, and they are, because these intersex conditions are in certain regions more often than others. There's a whole lot of reasons for that. So they're looking for these intersex conditions in certain females because they know they'll do well. And you're like, oh my God, that is really messing things up. So I've just argued back on myself.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that. I mean, obviously that became the issue over the Olympics with the boxing, right? And that was the first time I'd really heard of that. But I didn't know that it was so, not so common, but common enough that there are coaches out there actually seeking it. That's news to me. Wow.
Yeah, they are.
Jennifer, let's ask you, like, if you were a coach that was like fighting to hold on to your job, let's say you're a 500 coach and not a Hall of Fame coach, and you depend on this position to feed your family, wouldn't you also be recruiting any athlete that had some sort of advantage, whether it was perceived to be fair or unfair?
I mean, I will answer that question, but let me get to it, because I want you. That brings back up. Show me the incentive, and I'll show you the outcome. Right? I really liked that saying, and what I was thinking about when you first said it. And I'll answer the question around sportsmanship. But when you first said it, I mean, we've seen now people who, myself include, well, I actually did not make this choice, but I have enough Native American in me that I could have checked the Native American box when I was applying for a college. I did not do that, but you see that happening all the time. People choosing which box to choose, so that they can get the best outcome, including also with regards to sex and gender, non-binary. I mean, who's going to ask? You're going to come up and be like, give them a test and see whether or not they're non-binary, right? So, I mean, we've seen this not only in sports, but in real life with regards to college. Now, to answer your question, I mean, absolutely, as a coach, I am going to be looking for the best athlete. Again, this idea of intersex is so new to me. If I was not the world's best coach and had, all these advantages already kind of baked in, would I be looking for intersex women to compete? Sadly, most likely, yes. I would like to.
No, hang on a second. They would be males who seem to be females because of their intersex condition. So it's arguably actively cheating. If you follow me, there's certain conditions. 5A or D is the big one, which would be arguably Caster Semenya, Iman Khalif, that they present as female up until they hit puberty. When they hit puberty, their testicles and their penis grows, their testosterone comes in, and they become much stronger. And so, they're easily spotted, really, because they become so masculinized during the teen years. I would hope that, as I said before, I would prefer integrity to supersede inclusivity. And so, to answer Nafees's question, if I had a partner and children to feed, and I was faced with that, I would hope I would take the right action. I would do the right thing.
I think as a dissident, one of the right things would be is to create the policy around that, right? I mean,
And open it up.
nip it in the bud. Like, let's create the policy around this that supports me as a coach using my integrity over and above inclusivity.
Yeah, exactly.
What a hard question, though. Goodness. Well, on that note, for all of us to chew on, we've reached our time. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been, one of the most engaging conversations I've been in. So I hope that we have many more. And just again, thank you.
Thank you.
Here's to common sense, a third space, and parallel routes.
There you go.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.